Now my backwash hose pokes through this fence board, and then I leave it coiled here on the ground, and I've noticed that at the end of every day it seems to be full. You can see that there's some water in here, and I'm not sure why, but it's dripping out of the end. So it's filling up, which means that there must be water coming into the backwash. So here's my setup. It's really simple. We've got the pool pump down here on the right, and this is the inlets with the valve in between the two inlets going into the pump. The water's going up into the multi-port valve and the sand filter, and then from there it goes out to the heater outside, back from the heater, and then down back into the return valves to the jets. So here's the multi-port. The first clue that there's a problem is that there's this valve, this ball valve. Now, why would you need a ball valve on an outlet? When I have that open, you can hear it dripping or draining, and when it's closed, it stops. So the fact that the previous owner installed a ball valve means that there must be a need for it, which means that this outlet here on the multi-port must be leaky. And that's what's causing all the water in the hose. So what we're going to do first is take this multi-port off the sand filter. Next step is to let some air into the system so the system isn't pressurized, and that's going to make it a lot easier to take these hoses off the multi-port. So looking down here at my pump, on the side of my pump, I've got these two little thumb screw. And once I open these, that'll let some air in. You can tell it's letting air in because you can see that water level inside the pump is reducing. When it comes time to turn this back on, we're going to fill that back up with water to prime it, but for now it's just going to let some air in the system and release the pressure in these hoses. While that's happening, I'm going to figure out which socket I need, and I'm going to install a socket on the end of this driver to take off that hose clamp, this hose clamp, and this hose clamp. And that's going to let me remove the multi-port from the sand filter underneath. Right, I've determined it's a 5/16 socket. Put it on the end of my driver. You can use a socket wrench if you want to, or you could attach this to a screw gun, but it's easy enough to do by hand. It doesn't take much. I'm going to loosen this hose clamp. This one's a little tricky. You definitely don't want to damage this hose clamp because it's a specific part. It's not like your off-the-shelf hose clamp that you'll find at the automotive center. Now these other two are off the shelf. So I'm going to really take these hose clamps off. And they just unscrew pretty easily. You can use a little WD-40 if they're not cooperating. I can actually hear a hissing sound, which means there's more air entering the system now that I've opened up these hose clamps. I'm just going to wait a few seconds to let that air enter so it gets a little easier for me. On the other side of this multi-port, I'm going to unscrew this hose clamp and take off the backwash hose. It just pops right off like that. And in fact, I'm going to open up this ball valve and let the air pass right through it. That'll make it a little easier for us to get this multi-port off. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove these hoses one at a time. And I'm going to take these hoses off of the multi-port. One. That's two. Now I'm going to hear the air going into the system here. And now I'm going to lower this ring, this hose clamp ring, and that'll allow the multi-port to slide up out of the sand filter. So before I get started, I just want to lay out what type of tools you might need for this project. We've got a work surface, which I put some cardboard on so I don't damage the surface. Got paper towel, vinyl gloves, a C-wrench, my socket driver, drill, a multi-screwdriver, parts tray, and a large coffee. I've got the multi-port now on my temporary workbench here, and I'm going to remove this backwash ball valve to make it a little easier to work with. Alright, step number 2, we're taking the top off the multiport valve. You could use a Phillips screwdriver, or you could put a Phillips bit in the screw gun, which is a little faster. Just have to take your time with it. So, taking the top off the multiport. With all the screws removed and all the parts put in my parts tray, I can take the top off the multiport. And this is our first chance to see what's underneath. Now this is the bottom of the multiport, and it seats against the gasket. This is called a spider gasket. And here you can see really clearly that part of my gasket is lifted up out of its track. That's what's causing the leak. The water is passing through, and you can actually see it's going into the outlet where the multiport valve is located. So it's pretty obvious that that's what's causing the leak. First thing I'm going to do is remove this gasket, and I'm going to clean up any debris and leftover silicone, any bits and pieces in here, and for that I'm going to use paper towels and vinyl gloves. And while we're here, we're going to clean up the outside of this old multiport as well. Just takes a little elbow grease and a little cleaner. Right, in the process of cleaning that multiport, you saw me strip off 3 different gaskets. The spider gasket, which we talked about already. There's this big gasket, which fits on the bottom of the multiport valve, between the multiport and the sand filter. This gasket's in pretty good shape. It's round, doesn't have any visible cracks. Needs a little bit of cleaning, but it's pretty good shape. Before we put this back on, we're going to use a little bit of O-ring lube from the pool supply store. I'm going to coat the gasket with that and reseat the gasket on the rim here at the bottom of the multiport. The second O-ring that I took off, it's also in pretty good shape. I don't see any cracks or chunks taken out of it. And it's mostly round. It's been squeezed a little bit between the 2 surfaces, but it's in pretty good shape, so we're going to reuse it. It actually sits at the top of the multiport. It sits underneath the plunger, right on this surface edge, and there's a little groove for it here. So again, I'm going to apply some O-ring lube to the O-ring, and then I'm going to seat it back into its tray here, and we'll be ready to go. The third gasket is a spider gasket, and this is the one where we saw there was an issue. You can still see this one arm here. It's bent out of alignment. That's what's causing our leak and the water dripping through the backwash valve. So this one actually is a bit older, and it's not in great shape. And as you inspect it, you can see there are some fissures, there is some wear and tear. And it's just going to be a matter of time before one of these arms goes. It's also been ground down a bit because the plunger surface actually pushes against it. And as you move the plunger around, it sometimes rubs against these surfaces. And you can see it's much flatter here than in other places in the gasket. So this really should be replaced. You might get another season out of this, but if you're in here anyway, you may as well replace it. So I went down to the pool store and grabbed a replacement. This is about 25 bucks, and Hayward only make 2 versions for the multiport valves. This is a Hayward Veriflow valve, which is probably 15 years old. This is a 5-leg spider gasket, and they also make a 4-leg. So it's really easy to figure out if you have the right one. You'll have to pick between 4 or 5 different models. If they've got a 5-leg and it's a Hayward, then it's the correct one for this particular Veriflow valve. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to use the O-ring lube on it again. I'm going to insert it into the multiport. But first, you can see in the multiport, although it's dry, there's still a bit of gunk
and I'm going to clean that out with a small toothbrush that I have here. Now we're going to apply the lubricant, the O-ring lube, to the spider gasket and insert the spider gasket into the multiport. Some people like to put a glue or adhesive or a silicone on the bottom here and seat the multiport, seat the gasket into the multiport that way. You could do that. It does make it more difficult to take out later if you have to replace it. It shouldn't be needed, so I'm going to try it without that to start and see how it goes. Now I'm seating the spider gasket back into the multiport, just gently pushing it down all the way around in the center spoke and then each of the legs to make sure they sit into the track that's provided there. And I can see there's plenty of lubricant on it, which is great. Looks like a good fit. And now we're going to put the top back on the multiport. All right, we're going to put the top plunger back onto the multiport. We've got our O-ring nicely lubricated in here. This is in good shape. Sometimes you have debris in this area that you need to clear out, but in our case it's in great shape and the spring works well. I'm going to seat it back on top, and there's no confusion about which way it sets because the filter, in my case, always matches up with the pressure gauge. So for this type of valve, we've lined it up really well. I am going to push down and move the plunger in between two different settings, and what that does is it'll tighten up the spring, and it means that when this sits on top of the multiport, there's no gap here. If the springs are extended, it'll sit like this. You'll never be able to get it down tightly. So depressing it first and then inserting it allows it to sit flush. Now I'm going to go around and I'm going to put in a screw and a nut in each of the holes and tighten them up in the same type of fashion that you would on a car lug nut. So one side and then the opposing side. Before I put the 6th screw in, I'm going to go around and tighten the other 5. Just before I do, I want to show you that each of these nuts that go on the bottom have a side with a rib around it. You see the ribbing? And they have a side without. And the idea is you put the rib side up, it sits against the plastic and helps keep the nut in place as the screw gets tightened down. Alright, now we're going to move the plunger over to filter and depress it. And that's going to allow us to put the last bolt in and the nut that goes underneath. I'm going to go around and tighten all of them by hand one more time just to make sure they're tight but not over tightened. All right, should be done there. Next, I'm going to rotate this to where my drain is, and I'm going to reinsert my backwash ball valve. But first, I'm going to put a little Teflon tape on the threads. And now that I got my ball valve with the Teflon tape on the ends, I'm going to thread it back into the multiport outlet. And we're back at the sand filter, and before I reinsert my multiport valve, I'm going to take a few seconds to just give this a clean. Make sure that that O-ring sits nice on top of this rim. Also clean off some of the debris that's in here. Okay, time to reintroduce the multiport to the sand filter. It inserts pretty cleanly. As long as you have it lined up in the center, then the outlet mates with the vertical pipe underneath. You can see what's going to happen here. There we go, sits right in. O-ring is going to get compressed there. And we're going to line it up and put this hose clamp collar back on. I found the best way to get this collar on is to start at one edge and then work your way around really slowly. You really don't want to break this thing because it is a special part that you'd have to go to a pool store to replace. You can't just run down to the hardware store. Now once it's seated and both the multiport and the sand filter are within this collar, I'm going to go ahead and tighten this up. before leaving this, you're going to want to check all the way around, even around the back, just to make sure that it's seated properly and it's a nice fit, because if that's not nice and tight, seated properly, you're going to have water pouring out of there once you start the pump. And now it's time for the hoses to go back on. This is the hose from the pump. I'm going to insert that and then use the hose clamp that I've got sitting here. Tightening up this hose clamp again, trying not to over tighten this. I can always tighten it up a little bit after the system's running if I notice a drip. And this is the hose that connects to the outlet. This goes to my pool heater. You have to kind of wiggle this one to get it on. Now that I've got that hose in place, I'm going to use the clamp up here to make sure I got a good fit. Now that I've got that hose on nice and snug, I'm going to use this hose clamp to tighten it up. Okay, that's two hoses, and my backwash needs to be hooked back up to its hose. Okay, I've got the backwash and my backwash hose. I'll reinsert that. This is just a very thin vinyl hose, and I've got a hose clamp on here too, so I'm going to tighten that up. I'm going to remember to set this backwash valve open. While we're in the process, now seems like a really good time to clean out the old pump filter. So on the front end of the pump filter, you've got the lid with that gasket. I'm going to take this and give it a good clean. And there's a basket which I clean out fairly regularly. So I'll take that, give that a good clean too. To reinsert the pump filter. Clean this out now and reinsert in the pump. And I don't have a hose nearby, so I'm going to go fill up a bucket probably 3 or 4 times and pour the water in to prime the pump. Now you could just put the cover on the pump, the cover back on, and just start it, but the pump would be working really hard against the vacuum to suck all the water up from the skimmer and the drain in the pool. And the problem is that on an older pump like this, it's going to put a lot of strain on that pump. So I'm just going to go fill a bucket, empty it into the pump a few times, and that should help prime it. Okay, all right, after a few buckets of water, it's time to put the cover back on. Tighten this up. I have to use 2 hands to do this. Tighten this up, and then we should be good to start the pump. Okay, the pool pump is started, and you can see it got dry pretty quick. So the pump's working hard to bring up the water from the return valves here. It should start to fill. There it comes. Once we see the water in the pump, we can start to check for leaks. And yeah, sure enough, we got some joints here that are going to need to be tightened. Okay, after a little tightening of these hose clamps here, I haven't got any drips, so I think we're good on that side. Now there won't be any drips here yet because, of course, the backwash is currently closed because we got the valve in filter position. So the next step is to test the backwash. I'm going to turn off the pump and I'm going to switch this plunger over to backwash. All right, the pump is off. I'm going to depress. I'm going to rotate until I get to backwash. There we go. Backwash. Now I'm all set. I'm going to run this pump and we're going to keep an eye out and see what happens with the backwash. Alright, pump's back on. I've got a pretty full hose. A little drip here, so I'm going to tighten that up a little bit. And we've been running here for about 10 minutes now, just on the regular filter setting. And I'm not seeing any drips or water coming out of the backwash hose, so I think that leak is done. I think the use of that new spider gasket has fixed the problem. Hopefully I won't have any leaking for a while. Alright, we've had the pump running for about 15 minutes now, and I'm not seeing any dripping out of the backwash hose. It's really dry. All of this is just air. So I think we've done it. I think the application of that new spider gasket has done the trick, and hopefully if you're watching this you found it useful. Good luck with your pool.